basement. Midnight, December the 29th, 1916, sliding into the 30th. A single lamp burns over a table set with wine and small iced cakes. Upstairs, a gramophone plays the same record on a loop. Laughter, footsteps, the sound of a party that isn't really happening. The man sitting at that table is enormous by the standards of the room. Tall, broad through the shoulders, a beard that hasn't seen scissors in years, eyes so pale they look almost colorless in lamplight. He has just eaten the cakes. He has just finished a glass of Madeira. Both, he does not know, have been dosed with enough cyanide to drop a horse. Upstairs, a young prince checks his watch for the 10th time in 20 minutes. He is waiting for silence, for a body hitting the floor. It doesn't come. Instead, the bearded man in the basement wipes crumbs from his beard, looks up at his host with an expression that isn't fear and isn't confusion, and asks, quite calmly, for more wine. Something in that basement is about to break every rule the men upstairs thought they understood. Before the sun rises over St. Petersburg, this man, the most gossiped about, most feared, most mythologized private citizen in the entire Russian Empire, will be dead. But how he dies will be argued about for over 100 years, dissected in books, disputed by historians, and inflated into legend by the very men who killed him. To understand why a prince is standing over a basement staircase with a revolver in his hand, we have to go back. Almost 50 years. To a frozen riverbank at the far edge of the map, where a peasant woman is giving birth to a child nobody expected to survive the week, let alone bring down a 300-year dynasty. This is the true story of Grigori Rasputin. Two Russias. Unroll a map of the Russian Empire in 1900 and it stretches across 11 time zones, nearly a third of the way around the planet. At one end sits St. Petersburg, gilded domes, marble embankments, electric chandeliers in a city built specifically to make the rest of Europe jealous. At the other end, thousands of miles east, past forests that seem to swallow the horizon, sits Siberia. Winter, there isn't weather. It's an opponent. Villages had no roads worth the name, no doctors, often no school. Life was measured the way it had been measured for centuries. In harvests survived, winters endured, children who lived long enough to have children of their own. In the coldest stretches of a Siberian winter, you can throw a cup of boiling water into the air and watch it turn to snow before it hits the ground. That's the world this story starts in. Both places answer to the same man, the Tsar, an emperor with more unchecked power over more human lives than almost any ruler on earth. But they were, in every way that mattered, different countries wearing the same flag. This is the story of what happened when someone from the cold, forgotten Russia walked into the glittering one, and instead of being shown the door, was handed a seat at the table. His name was Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin. This is how a barely literate peasant from a village most Russians had never heard of ended up, decades later, holding more sway over an empress than her own doctors, her own ministers, and very nearly her own husband. The exact date is genuinely disputed. Siberian peasant birth records were kept loosely, if at all, and different documents point to different years. Most historians land on January of 1869 in a village called Pokrovskoye on the banks of the Tura River in western Siberia. Picture it honestly. One dirt road, frozen solid most of the year, lined with single-story wooden houses, a church, a tavern, no school, a few thousand people who farmed, fished, and answered to no one they'd ever actually met. That was Pokrovskoye. His parents, Yefim and Anna Rasputin, were peasant farmers, free by law, but tied to the land through the Mir, the communal system that governed rural Russia. Yefim had a bit of standing in the village. He served as a courier between Pokrovskoye and the nearby towns of Tobolsk and Tyumen, carting goods and official messages along the river road. It wasn't wealth. It was one half step above the bottom. And before Grigori ever drew breath, tragedy had already made itself at home in that family. Different records give different numbers, but the pattern is the same across all of them. Most of his brothers and sisters died in infancy or early childhood. Grigori was one of the only children to survive into adulthood. Growing up as the child who lived in a house that had buried so many who didn't shapes a person. We don't know exactly how it shaped him, but it's hard to believe it didn't. The surname Rasputin likely comes from an old Russian word connected to crossroads. Rasputia, a place where roads split. Some historians think it described exactly where his family lived, at a literal fork near the river. Others think it's just an old surname with no hidden meaning. Even his own name comes wrapped in ambiguity. Almost as soon as he could walk, the village noticed something about the boy. Some said his stare made grown men uneasy, pale, blue-gray eyes that seemed to look past your face and into whatever you were trying to hide. Some claimed he'd predicted a horse theft before anyone knew a horse was missing. Whether any specific story is true is impossible to verify a century later. Reputations like this tend to grow retroactively, stitched together after someone becomes famous, but the pattern holds across every account we have. Long before Grigori Rasputin ever left Siberia, his neighbors already talked about him as someone who saw things. Rasputin never attended school in any real sense and remained functionally illiterate well into adulthood. This same uneducated boy would go on to sit in rooms with some of the most powerful, most highly educated people in Europe, and out-talk most of them. Was he genuinely spiritually gifted, as his believers would later swear, or a sharp, watchful kid who learned early how to read a room and work it? Historians are still split. Both could be true at once. What's certain is that Pokrovskoye was never going to hold him. If you'd met Grigori Rasputin at 19, you would have bet against a monastery, let alone a palace. Village and police records from his youth describe a young man with a short fuse and a taste for trouble. Drinking, brawling, accused more than once of petty theft. One surviving account has him mouthing off to the local mayor and spending 2 days in the village lockup for it. Later legends claim he stole a horse and fled to a monastery to escape the consequences. Historians can't confirm it, but it fits the pattern of everything else we know about him at that age. And yet, in the middle of all this, he got married. Around 1889, he wed Praskovia Dubrovina, a young woman from a neighboring village. She would go on to give birth to 9 children by some counts, most of whom, echoing his own childhood, didn't survive. 3 lived to adulthood, a son, Dmitri, and 2 daughters, Maria, known as Matriona, and Varvara. Praskovia's life gets almost no space in the history books, and that itself says something about whose stories survive. She stayed married to Rasputin for the rest of his life, raising their children largely alone in Pokrovskoye, while her husband spent years at a stretch 1,000 miles away, at the center of the most talked-about scandal in the empire. When people brought up his affairs to her face, she is reported to have shrugged it off with a line that survived in more than one account. He has enough for all. Whatever that means about their marriage, it wasn't naivety. Despite everything that followed, Rasputin kept sending money home to Praskovia and the children, and returned to Pokrovskoye more than once, even after he'd become the most famous peasant in Russia. The marriage was never dissolved. Something changed in him after that. Historians disagree on exactly what. His own later writing points to a vision. Other accounts point to something plainer, the accumulated weight of dead siblings, dead children, and a life of drinking that was going nowhere. Whatever the actual spark, the wild young man from Pokrovskoye was about to disappear, and someone stranger was about to take his place. In his early 20s, Rasputin traveled to Verkhoturye Monastery in the Ural Mountains, a real pilgrimage site, home to relics believed to have healing power. There he met an elder named Makari, a former sinner turned hermit, and the encounter reshaped him. Here's the detail. Almost everyone gets wrong later. Rasputin never became a monk. He took no vows, was never ordained, never held any official position in the Russian Orthodox Church. Not then, not ever. Monastery life, with its silence and its schedules and its obedience to other men's rules, wasn't built for him. What did fit him was something looser, the tradition of the stranik, the wanderer, the pilgrim. In late 19th century Russia, there were, by some estimates, close to 1 million people living this way, owning almost nothing, walking from village to village and church to church, surviving purely on the charity of strangers, believed by ordinary Russians to carry a closeness to God precisely because they'd given up everything material. Becoming a stranik required no permission, no license, no test. Anyone who felt the calling could simply start walking, which meant a barely literate former troublemaker from Siberia could present himself as a holy wanderer. and there was no official mechanism on Earth to prove he wasn't. That detail matters more than almost anything else in this story. Every ounce of religious authority Rasputin would ever hold came from nothing but his own presence and the impression he made on the people standing in front of him. No institution ever vouched for him. He built the entire thing himself, one conversation at a time. Starting around 1897, Rasputin began the long habit that would define the next decade of his life. He'd simply pack up and walk, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months. He crossed Russia on foot more than once, and made 2 pilgrimages that mattered enormously to his growing reputation. One to Mount Athos in Greece, the most sacred site in Orthodox monasticism, and one all the way to Jerusalem. He wrote about these journeys himself, years later, in a short autobiography, and his own words are more vivid than anything a biographer could invent. He described going days eating almost nothing but potatoes, walking from Tobolsk to Kiev without changing his clothes for half a year, praying at the side of the road whenever exhaustion caught up with him. He was robbed. He was beaten by people who assumed a filthy wanderer was fair game. This wasn't performance. It was genuinely brutal. Mount Athos, the holy mountain Rasputin visited, has barred women from setting foot on it for over 1,000 years, a rule still enforced today. By the time he came home, he was unrecognizable, not just to his neighbors, but to himself. A long, unkempt beard, peasant clothes worn like a statement, and that stare, now sharpened by years of practice, into something people across every social class would describe the same way, hypnotic, unsettling, like he was looking straight through you. Word spread that there was a holy man moving through the countryside, and strange things happened around him. People brought him their sickness, their grief, their fear, and some swore they left feeling better. We should be honest here, the way real historians are. There's no medical evidence Rasputin possessed any actual healing power. But there's strong evidence he possessed something almost as potent, an intensely calming presence delivered through eye contact and unbroken attention in an era with almost no other treatment on offer for pain, anxiety, or grief. Belief and focus are not miracles, but they are real medicine in their own limited way. Long before Rasputin ever laid eyes on a member of the royal family, he already had a devoted following among ordinary peasants and townspeople. His fame among common people came first. The palace came years later. As Rasputin wandered, he inevitably brushed against the fringes of Russian religious life, sects and splinter groups that existed in the gray zone the official church tolerated but never fully accepted. One of these was the Klisti, a mystical offshoot whose secret ceremonies reportedly included frenzied dancing, spoken ecstasy, and, according to hostile witnesses, sexual ritual built on the theological idea that sin had to be fully experienced before it could be transcended. Here's where we need to slow down, because this is exactly the kind of accusation that gets more solid the more times it's repeated. Rasputin denied any connection to the Klisti his entire life. Church authorities investigated more than once and never produced conclusive proof either way. Historians remain genuinely split today. Some think he had real early contact with Klisti practices during his wandering years. Others think the accusation was manufactured or wildly exaggerated later by people who understood exactly how much damage a heresy charge could do to a religious figure's credibility. The honest answer is that nobody, then or now, can say for certain. But the accusation alone did real damage, whether it was true or not. Rasputin's appearance became almost as famous as his reputation. Unusually tall for a peasant, heavy-set gray-green eyes, a long dark beard, black clothing that made him look, in the words of one contemporary, like he'd walked directly out of an icon. He was also, by multiple first-hand accounts, entirely unconcerned with polite manners. He'd pick at his food, interrupt aristocrats mid-sentence, and mock high society to its face. And somehow none of it seemed to cost him a single follower. By the early 1900s, word of the strange magnetic wanderer had reached Kazan, where local clergy were impressed enough to arrange his introduction to bishops in the imperial capital. Rasputin was about to meet the city that would make him and eventually destroy him. St. Petersburg at the turn of the century was a city of violent contrasts, palaces lit by electric light, still a novelty, sitting a few streets from factory tenements where people froze in winter. It was also improbably obsessed with the occult. Here's something that surprises most people. In the early 1900s, Russia's wealthiest, most educated aristocrats were fascinated by mystics, faith healers, seances, and holy wanderers. It wasn't shameful. It was almost fashionable. The formal Orthodox Church could feel distant and rehearsed to a bored, spiritually restless upper class. A raw, unfiltered holy man from deep Siberia felt, to them, more real. Rasputin wasn't even the first mystic the imperial family had grown attached to. Years earlier, a French occultist named Philippe Nizier-Vachon, sometimes called Monsieur Philippe, had become a fixture in Nicholas and Alexandra's inner circle, claiming spiritual gifts of his own and reportedly performing rituals meant to help Alexandra conceive a son. When Philippe died in 1905, it left a very specific emptiness behind, one perfectly shaped for whoever arrived next. This detail changes the whole picture. Alexandra wasn't simply tricked out of nowhere by a stranger. She had already shown for years a genuine willingness to trust mystics who promised what medicine couldn't. Rasputin didn't create that hunger. He walked into a hunger that was already waiting. His introduction came through respected St. Petersburg churchmen who found him compelling, and, decisively, through two noblewomen, Militsa and Anastasia of Montenegro, princesses who had married into the Russian royal family. Society had a nickname for them, whispered behind fans at court balls, the Crow Sisters. Some say for their dark hair and dramatic dress, others for a reputation for circling gossip the way crows circle carrion. Either way, it stuck. Both women were deeply drawn to seances and mysticism, and both were captivated the moment they met Rasputin. They decided he needed to meet the Tsar. Rasputin was formally introduced to Nicholas and Alexandra in November 1905, the same turbulent year that had just seen Russia's first major revolutionary uprising and forced Nicholas to grant the empire its first elected assembly, the Duma. He didn't arrive during a calm moment. He arrived while the whole system was already shaking. Nicholas's own diary records the meeting in almost throwaway language. A peasant from Siberia, he wrote, who had made a strong impression on him and his wife, so strong that a conversation planned for 5 minutes ran past an hour. It reads like nothing at all. It marks the beginning of a relationship that would help bring down a 300-year dynasty. Because what Rasputin didn't know yet, what almost no one outside the family's tightest circle knew, was the secret this family was guarding about their only son. In 1904, after 4 daughters, Nicholas and Alexandra finally had a son, Alexei, heir to the Russian throne. Cannon fire greeted the news across St. Petersburg. Russia, finally, had its future emperor. And almost immediately, the family discovered something devastating. Alexei had hemophilia, a genetic disorder where blood doesn't clot properly. A minor bump that would leave you or me with a bruise could send Alexei into internal bleeding that wouldn't stop, swelling agonizingly into his joints, in some episodes threatening his life outright. Hemophilia was known as the royal disease. It had been passed down through several of Europe's royal families, traced back to Britain's Queen Victoria, Alexandra's own grandmother. Alexandra hadn't caused it in any way anyone at the time understood, but she carried a crushing weight of guilt over it regardless. And here's what made it worse. This was a state secret. Nicholas didn't tell his own mother the full truth for years. He didn't tell his sisters. The reasoning was cold and political. Russia in the early 1900s was already unstable, with liberals demanding a constitution and revolutionaries demanding the whole system's collapse. If ordinary Russians learned the only male heir might not survive to adulthood, it could shatter public confidence at the worst possible moment. As one historian studying the era has put it, many of the empire's deepest problems began, quite literally, in the nursery. So the family smiled in public, presented Alexei as a healthy heir, and lived behind closed doors in constant, quiet terror of every fall, every bump, every unexplained bruise. Put yourself for a moment in Alexandra's position. Your only son carries a condition no doctor in the world can treat. Every ordinary day carries real danger. You can't tell most of the people around you the truth. You are, in the most important sense, entirely alone with this fear. That was exactly the situation Rasputin walked into, and one night, in particular, convinced Alexandra, beyond argument, beyond doubt, that this strange wanderer held a power no doctor in Europe possessed. In the autumn of 1912, while the family was staying at the Spawa hunting estate, young Alexei suffered a severe internal injury after a rough carriage ride. Bleeding centered near his hip and abdomen. His fever climbed. According to those present, his pain became so intense he could be heard begging his mother to make it stop. The doctors surrounding him quietly began to believe there was nothing left to do. Alexandra, in complete desperation, sent a telegram to Rasputin, who was far away in Siberia at the time. His reply, by the most widely trusted accounts, told her not to grieve, that the illness wasn't as dangerous as it looked, and that the doctors should stop fussing over the boy so much. And then, however you want to explain it, Alexei's condition began to improve. We have to be honest about what we don't know. It's entirely possible this was simply the natural course of a hemorrhage that would have stabilized on its own. Some historians have pointed out that aspirin, one of the drugs doctors were routinely giving Alexei, thins the blood and may well have been worsening his bleeding the whole time. If Rasputin's advice amounted to stop treating him so aggressively, he may have accidentally helped for reasons that had nothing to do with any special gift at all. None of that mattered to Alexandra. In her eyes, there was only one explanation. Rasputin had saved her son's life from hundreds of miles away through prayer alone, after every trained doctor around her had already given up. From that night forward, he stopped being an interesting mystic and became something close to irreplaceable, the one person standing between her son and death. Once a parent believes that about someone, there is almost nothing they won't forgive to keep that person close. This is the emotional engine of everything that follows, not simple foolishness. A mother's desperate, understandable love for a dying child, powerful enough to override every warning she'd otherwise have listened to. A holy wanderer who saves a dying prince is a miracle story. A grown man spending unsupervised evenings alone with an empress is a scandal. Somehow, Rasputin managed to become both at once. Through the early 1910s, his presence at court hardened from occasional visit into permanent fixture. He wrote to Alexandra constantly. He was consulted, quietly, on matters that had nothing to do with medicine, and as his access grew, so did the whispering. Remember, Rasputin held no official title, no church sanction, nothing protecting him but the trust he'd built person by person. That made him extraordinarily easy to attack, because there was no institution standing behind him when the accusations started flying, and plenty of former allies turned against him the moment his influence outgrew their comfort. Rumors of his Clisti ties resurfaced with new intensity. Newspapers, sensing an irresistible story, ran article after article about the wandering Siberian peasant who'd somehow wormed his way into the Empress's inner circle. The nickname that stuck for the rest of his life, and for over a century after his death, was the Mad Monk. He was never, at any point, actually a monk. It's one of the strangest ironies in this entire story. One of the most famous religious nicknames in history belonged to a man who had never taken a single religious vow. Nicholas and Alexandra were caught in an impossible position. Alexandra refused to entertain the worst rumors. In her mind, any attack on Rasputin was an attack on the one person keeping her son alive, and she treated skepticism as something close to betrayal. Nicholas, torn between his wife's fierce loyalty and mounting pressure from nobles, ministers, and his own extended family, chose again and again not to act. His own mother personally begged him to send Rasputin away. He didn't. By 1914, the whispers had grown loud enough to reach someone who decided whispering wasn't enough anymore. That year, for the first time, someone tried to kill him. On June 29, 1914, Rasputin was back home in Pokrovskoye when a woman named Kionia Guseva approached him outside his house. Guseva was a former follower of one of Rasputin's fiercest critics, a religious figure who'd convinced her that Rasputin was corrupting the imperial family. Concealing a knife, she stabbed him in the stomach, tearing him open badly enough that his intestines were exposed. It was, by any measure, a near-fatal wound. Rasputin survived only through emergency surgery and reportedly relied on pain medication for the rest of his life afterward. Guseva was arrested, declared mentally unfit to stand trial, and spent years afterward in psychiatric confinement. Whatever else Rasputin was, he wasn't simply resented by jealous courtiers in far-off palace corridors. real people who believed the rumors hated him enough to try to end his life themselves. The day before Guseva's attack, June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary had been assassinated in Sarajevo. Within weeks, that single killing would ignite the First World War. According to several accounts, Rasputin, still bandaged, still in real pain from his own wound, sent an urgent telegram to Nicholas, begging him not to lead Russia into the coming war. He warned, in words that have survived in more than one biography, that Russia would drown in blood and that the disaster would be immeasurable. We should be honest about how much weight to give this. Russia was locked into a web of alliances and national pride that made staying out of the war extraordinarily difficult, regardless of what Rasputin said. But it's well documented that he opposed the war loudly and early, while most of the government was swept up in patriotic enthusiasm. Nicholas didn't listen. In August 1914, Russia entered the war. Rasputin's warning would turn out to be one of the most accurate predictions of his entire life. Being right didn't earn him more trust. If anything, as the war dragged on and Russia began to suffer, the whispers about this strange man's closeness to the throne only grew louder and far more dangerous. By 1915, the war was going badly. Poorly equipped soldiers took devastating losses, supply lines collapsed, casualties climbed into the millions, and morale, in the army and at home, began to crack. In the late summer of 1915, Nicholas made a decision that would prove disastrous. He traveled to the front to personally command the army. It was meant to inspire the troops. In practice, it meant the Tsar was now absent from the capital for long stretches, and that day-to-day governing of Russia fell largely to Alexandra. And Alexandra, in turn, leaned heavily, dangerously heavily, on Rasputin. Surviving letters between her and Nicholas from this period show her repeatedly urging her husband to appoint or dismiss government ministers based partly on Rasputin's opinion of them. A man with no formal training in economics, military strategy, or statecraft, a wandering holy man from a Siberian village, could genuinely influence whether a minister kept his job. We need to be careful here, because this is where the story gets exaggerated most often. Some accounts from the era, many written by Rasputin's enemies, painted him as the secret puppet master running all of Russia, personally choosing generals like a shadow emperor. Most serious historians today think that goes too far. His direct political power was likely smaller than either his enemies or the public rumor mill believed, but his perceived influence did just as much damage as real influence would have, because it eroded public trust in the government almost as thoroughly as if every rumor had been true. Even members of Nicholas's own family begged him to send Rasputin away for good. His mother, his cousins, ministers across the government. Nicholas, caught between his wife's devotion and mounting pressure from nearly everyone else, is reported to have brushed off one of his own ministers with a line that circulated widely at the time. He'd rather have 10 Rasputins than one of the Empress's hysterical fits. Meanwhile, ordinary soldiers died by the hundreds of thousands. Bread lines stretched through St. Petersburg, and a rumor spread through every level of society that the country was being steered not by the Tsar, but by his German-born wife, viewed with fresh suspicion now that Russia was at war with Germany, and an uneducated peasant mystic with an increasingly scandalous reputation. Wartime gossip even blamed Rasputin, absurdly, for a cholera outbreak, claiming he'd imported poisoned fruit to sabotage the country on Germany's behalf. It's also worth being honest about an uglier part of the record. Rasputin held and expressed anti-Semitic views, and at times encouraged action against Russia's Jewish population, a population already facing state-sanctioned discrimination. He was not simply a misunderstood mystic caught in other people's propaganda. He was a real, flawed, sometimes genuinely harmful man, and treating him as a harmless fool does the actual history a disservice. By late 1916, a fiercely monarchist politician named Vladimir Purishkevich, a man who genuinely believed he was trying to save the monarchy, not destroy it, stood up in the Duma and delivered an explosive public speech accusing Rasputin of steering the country toward ruin through the Empress. The speech spread through St. Petersburg like fire through dry grass. Among those listening in total agreement was a young, wealthy prince who had already, quietly, begun imagining something far more permanent, His name was Felix Yusupov, and he was about to invite Rasputin to his home for the last time. Sometime in this final stretch, Rasputin's own health and outlook began to darken. He wrote in his journal that he sensed death was coming and had made a kind of peace with it, seeing himself, in his own telling, as something close to a sacrifice for the Russian people. He wrote a letter to Alexandra that reads today like a prophecy no one wanted to believe. In it, he warned that if a member of her own family had a hand in his death, none of the Romanovs would survive more than 2 years, that the Russian people themselves would rise up and kill them all. He told her he had already paid for them with his own blood, and asked her to pray and to be strong. We can't know how seriously anyone took this letter at the time. What we can say, with total certainty, is that it turned out to be almost exactly right. A fact that has fed more than a century of legend about Rasputin having genuine foresight, even as historians point out the far simpler explanation. He understood, correctly, just how many powerful enemies he'd made, and just how fragile the throne he was tied to had become. By December 1916, a small circle had formed around a single shared belief. Rasputin had to be permanently removed before his influence finished destroying what little credibility the monarchy had left. At the center stood Felix Yusupov, one of the richest men in Russia, married to Nicholas's own niece, alongside Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, one of the Tsar's own cousins, and Vladimir Purishkevich, whose Duma speech had helped light the fuse. A military doctor, Stanislas de Lazavert, was brought in to prepare poison. It's worth pausing on this. These were not revolutionaries trying to topple the monarchy. Quite the opposite. In their own minds, they were loyal monarchists trying to save the Tsar from a corrupting influence, convinced that removing one man could restore public faith in the throne before it was too late. It doesn't excuse the murder, but it explains how a prince, a grand duke, and a nobleman talked themselves into planning one. The plan, according to accounts later given by the conspirators themselves, most famously Yusupov, who wrote about that night in a memoir published more than a decade afterward, involved luring Rasputin to the Moika Palace under the pretense of a private late-night visit with the promise of an introduction to Yusupov's beautiful wife. We need to be honest about something important here. Much of what we know about that night comes from Yusupov's own retelling, and Yusupov changed and dramatized the story more than once across the following decades, adding details that made it sound more shocking and more supernatural each time he told it. Historians who've examined the surviving police reports and the original autopsy believe the real events of that night were almost certainly messier, quicker, and far less cinematic than the legend that grew around it. What we can say with confidence, on the night of December 29th into December 30th, 1916, Rasputin was invited to the Moika Palace. He did not come back out alive. Rasputin arrived just before midnight. According to Yusupov's account, he ate the cakes and drank the wine, both supposedly laced with cyanide by Dr. Lazavert. 2.5 hours passed. Nothing happened. Rasputin, by this telling, seemed entirely unaffected. Growing desperate, and by his own admission, genuinely frightened, Yusupov went upstairs, borrowed Grand Duke Dmitry's revolver, came back down, and shot Rasputin once in the chest. Rasputin collapsed. The conspirators went upstairs to regroup. When Yusupov returned to check the body, Rasputin's eyes reportedly opened, and he lunged at his attacker before crawling toward a side door and out into the courtyard, where Purishkevich shot him several more times, including, according to the account most historians find credible, one final shot to the forehead at close range. His body was wrapped, driven to the Petrovsky Bridge, and dropped through a hole cut in the ice of the frozen Malaya Nevka River. Now here's where legend and record start to pull apart. Yusupov's memoir insists Rasputin survived poison that should have killed him outright, absorbed a bullet to the heart, and still had enough life left in him to nearly strangle his attacker, writing, decades later, that something about the man's refusal to die felt almost demonic. It's a gripping story. It's also, according to most historians who've studied the case, largely theater. The original 1917 autopsy, later re-examined by forensic historians, found no clear evidence of poison in his system at all, which raises real doubt about whether the cyanide was ever properly administered or administered at all. What the autopsy did find was straightforward and considerably less mythical. multiple gunshot wounds, including one to the head fired at close range, consistent with an execution-style shot rather than a desperate final struggle. In other words, the man probably wasn't unkillable. He was very likely dead, or close to it, well before he ever reached the river. The idea that he kept fighting through poison and bullets that should have ended him instantly is largely the invention of the one man who had every reason to make his own story sound as dramatic and as heroic as possible. One more legend deserves a mention, mostly because it survived so stubbornly. The claim that Rasputin's body was later mutilated and a preserved body part put on display as a grim trophy, supposedly visible today in a museum in St. Petersburg. It's one of the most repeated facts about Rasputin online. It's also almost certainly false. Scientists who've examined the specimen in question have concluded it most likely belongs to an animal, not a man. The legend has proven far harder to kill than the story it's attached to. When Rasputin's body was pulled from the river and the news broke across the capital, Russia didn't react with one emotion. It reacted with several, all completely at odds with each other. Inside the palace, pure grief. Alexandra had lost, in her own mind, the one person keeping her son alive. She had him buried quietly on palace grounds, and reportedly kept a small collection of his letters and belongings for the rest of her life. Nicholas's reaction was quieter and harder to read. Sorrow for his wife, mixed, some historians believe, with a private relief that a source of enormous public criticism had finally been removed, even by his own family's hand. Out in the streets, the reaction was closer to celebration. Nicholas's own mother reportedly welcomed the news, a sentiment shared across much of the court, and even echoed by parts of the church hierarchy. To many ordinary Russians, and much of the aristocracy alike, Rasputin's death felt like poison finally being removed from the body of the nation. Yusupov and Grand Duke Dmitri, despite having conspired to commit a murder, faced almost no legal consequence. Because they were royalty and high nobility, Nicholas simply exiled them, Dmitri to the Persian front, Yusupov to a family estate, rather than putting either man on trial. In an ordinary court, murder brought serious punishment. For these two, it brought a change of scenery. But here's the sobering truth this chapter has to land on. Killing Rasputin didn't fix anything. The conspirators had convinced themselves that removing one man would restore faith in the monarchy and calm the unrest. It didn't, because Rasputin was never the actual cause of Russia's deepest problems: the war, the food shortages, the gulf between nobility and everyone else, years of political pressure that had been building long before he ever set foot in St. Petersburg. He had become a symbol of those problems. Removing the symbol didn't remove any of the pressure underneath it. Rasputin died on December 30th, 1916. What followed moved faster than almost anyone, including his own killers, could have imagined. In February 1917, mass protests broke out in the capital over bread shortages, war exhaustion, and years of accumulated anger at a government most Russians no longer trusted. The uprising, remembered today as the February Revolution, spread so fast that within days the army itself refused to keep defending the monarchy. On March 15, 1917, barely 2.5 months after Rasputin's murder, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for over 300 years, was finished within a single winter. The railway carriage in which Nicholas signed his abdication would become historically significant twice more. German officials chose that same carriage in 1918 to formally end the First World War, and in 1940, Adolf Hitler deliberately sought it out to accept France's surrender in the exact same spot, a calculated act of humiliation. History has an unsettling habit of returning to the same rooms. Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children were placed under arrest, and as civil war broke out across the country, moved progressively further from the capital. In July 1918, in a house in the city of Yekaterinburg, the entire family, Nicholas, Alexandra, all 5 children, and several loyal servants, were executed by revolutionary soldiers. Sit with that for a moment. Alexei, the sick little boy whose fragile life opened the door for a Siberian wanderer to walk into the most powerful court in Europe, never grew up. He was 13 years old. Historians will likely never fully agree on how much responsibility Rasputin personally bears for the fall of the monarchy. He didn't start the war. He didn't create the poverty or the political rot that had been building for decades before he ever arrived. Those forces were already there, already pushing the empire toward collapse. But at the worst possible moment, he became the face of everything people had stopped trusting about their rulers. Proof, in the public imagination, that the throne had lost touch with reality and surrounded itself with the wrong people. Whether that symbol was fair to him or not, it mattered enormously. What people believe about a moment in history can shape what happens next, just as much as what actually happened. Who was Grigori Rasputin, really? Strip away the legends, the resurrection from poison, the bullets that couldn't kill him, the trophy in a jar, and what's left is a real, complicated human being. A peasant boy who grew up in a house shaped by early death. A wild young man who found something in faith that reshaped his entire life. A wanderer who built genuine trust among ordinary people, on foot, over years, long before anyone in a palace ever heard his name. A man whose closeness to real power made him reckless, careless with his own reputation, and in some documented ways, his anti-Semitism, his treatment of the women around him, genuinely harmful, not merely misunderstood. Historian Douglas Smith, who has studied Rasputin's life as closely as anyone, put it plainly. The Rasputin most Russians thought they knew was largely a fantasy, but a dangerous one, a fantasy that ended up poisoning the throne it attached itself to. Because underneath the myth, this is really a story about desperation, about how a mother's love for a dying son was powerful enough to make her trust a man almost no one else trusted, simply because he was the one person offering hope after every doctor in the world had run out. It's a story about isolation, about how a small enough circle of trust, closed tightly around a family, can shut out every honest warning from the outside. The more people criticized Rasputin, the closer Alexandra pulled him, and the more sealed off the family became from the voices that might have actually helped them. And it's a story about how easily fear and hope can be turned against us, how the right person, arriving at exactly the right desperate moment, claiming exactly what we need to hear, can end up with influence far beyond anything they've actually earned. None of us will ever sit beside an empress or hold the fate of an empire in our hands, but every one of us will, at some point, feel scared or desperate or alone with a problem too big to solve, and in that moment we'll have to decide who we trust and why. Grigori Rasputin's strange tangled life, from a frozen riverbank at the edge of the map to a locked basement beneath a St. Petersburg palace, leaves behind something worth remembering long after the story ends. The people we let closest to us, especially in our most frightened moments, shape more of our lives, and sometimes, as this story proves, more of history than we ever expect. That is the true story of Grigori Rasputin,